So on behalf of the Peoria Area World Affairs Council, welcome. And this is our May program on China, and we are delighted this evening to have Melaine Sisson join us. She is a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Program's Strobe Talbot Center for Security, Strategy, and Technology, where she researches the use of armed forces in international politics, strategies of deterrence, U.S. national security strategy, defense policy, and defense applications of emerging technologies. Sisson's current work focuses on the U.S. nuclear strategy and the role of nuclear weapons in foreign policy. She also serves on the advisory council of the North Rhine-Westphalian Academy for International Affairs based in Bonn, Germany. Sisson previously was vice president of analysis at Govini, an early stage national security AI/ML technology company, and senior fellow and director of the Stimson Center, the Stimson Center Defense Strategy and Planning Program. At Stimson, Sisson partnered with the Stanley Center and the UN Office of Disarmament Affairs to address the implications for international security of military applications of AI and published Military Coercion and U.S. Foreign Policy, the Use of Force Short of War in 2020. A former senior national security project associate with the RAND Corporation, manager of program evaluations for a nonprofit mental health organization, and member of the U.S. intelligence community, Sisson earned a doctorate in political science from the University of Colorado in Boulder and a master's from the Columbia University School of International Affairs. She is a consultant to the U.S. Department of Defense, lectures regularly with universities nationwide, and is published in national media outlets and academic journals. And I thought I had it pulled up. Yes, we do. The United States, China, and the Competition for Control is the book that she most recently published. It just came out this year, and Don is going to address many of the issues that she raises in that book. Welcome, Dr. Sisson. Don, take us away.
All right. Thank you, Angela. And Melanie, again, a special thanks for joining us tonight. We've mentioned to people this was to be an in-person discussion between you and I. Situations arise, but we give thanks that COVID gave us Zoom and that we can still have this opportunity. And yes, I have read your book. Let me ask you first, though. I kind of think that might be for those of us that are more into policy wonkism and so on. I think the average reader would benefit. I thought it was a great history of the liberal global order. But what would you say to people if they want to get your book to read it? What to look for?
Well, first of all, thanks, Don, for doing this tonight. I really appreciate it. And I'm delighted to have people join. Virtual is better than nothing, as you said. So it is one of the few good things we can say came out of the pandemic. So I think when I will tell you from the start that the reason I wrote this book is because I felt like I needed to learn something. I came to Washington, D.C., back from other places in 2018. And the conversation about China had changed dramatically and started to accelerate really quickly in terms of a contentious relationship between the United States and China. And it surprised me just how fast that change had happened, how quickly the relationship seemed to have degraded. And I didn't quite understand why. And so the book is literally the product of me going about trying to understand this debate that was all of a sudden very live in Washington, D.C., and thought I had very serious implications for what we do with our military, when, why, and how, and in particular made me uncomfortable about sort of the idea that there were some who think that a war between the United States and China we're moving in that direction. So I wanted to understand what was happening. And so I think what I would say about the book as a result is that I hope it's useful for anybody who had the same kinds of questions that I did, which is, there's this narrative about international order and the United States and China. Well, what is international order? And what is this one that we say that we're in now? And what's our vision for it? And what's China's vision for it? So it really is, I think, not just a basic history, but one that I hope sort of is grounded in a very contemporary policy debate that's really consequential.
Well, it was perfect for me because after being last year at Bastogne a year ago, Thinking of the 80th anniversary coming up, we're going to do a program in September looking at the 80 years of the growth of the liberal order that the United States built and why the United States has rejected the world that it built, as we're currently seeing. I have your book really highlighted. There's dog ears, so it's going to get a lot of use. And I want to give you special thanks because you've helped me put it, I think, into an excellent synthesis of what I'm looking for to talk about. But let's get directly into, as someone, as a citizen following this, the two camps that one day after reading your book, I was in your camp. When I read uh, Everything Under Heaven, I'm in their camp. I have the 100-Year Marathon by Michael Pillsbury. I was in his camp, no longer am. Um, I'm saying and I think you expressed it, one of the struggles we have is, who is China to us? Now, my question is going to come from a review that Paul Hare um, wrote, China's not seeking to remake the world order in the national interest, about your book. And he says, China's goal is not to usurp the U.S. role and unilaterally set the rules of international behavior, but instead to increase its role relative to that of the United States in setting the rules. But then we have Trump's national security advisor, Mike Waltz, or X, has stated that we are, I believe, in a Cold War with China because its goal is replacing the American dream and American leadership around the world with the Chinese dream and the Chinese leadership. And he goes on to say that you persuasively refute the notion that China is seeking to supplant the United States as the global hegemon. So I'm going to let you kind of summarize a little bit your position that challenges that China is trying to take over from the United States.
Well, so thanks for putting this in the context of a conversation among different scholars trying to understand the world around us. I think what it highlights is that as with many things in life, it is a matter of interpretation and how deeply you engage with history, with even philosophy, with culture, not just with current events, but trying to sort of locate all of these things together over time. One book I would add to your list if you haven't read it, that I think has been very influential here in Washington, D.C., is a book called The Long Game by Rush Doshi. And he it doesn't surprise me that you have, his work, he read, reams and reams of very dry policy papers and white papers from the Chinese government. And it's a really creditable piece of scholarship. And yet, reading through some of the same materials and the translations of them, I came to a different interpretation. He and I saw very different things. So he and others that sort of in DC are called the China Hawks. Mike Waltz, I assume it still is one, even though he's now shifted positions in government. And a handful of others who were in the first Trump administration and some of whom are now in the second, share Rush Doshi's interpretation that says China is a growing power. It has a long history. It has investments in its own national pride and status, and it, of course, will want to express that in international politics. And they look at a lot of history, usually from the Western world, about how states who grow in power tend to behave. And the argument from that history is to say, well, as they gain in power, they want to have more influence and they start throwing sharp elbows and trying to push others out of the way. They'd like to have things go their way more of the time with less of a fight if they at all can. And so we should expect China to behave similarly. And they pull a number of sort of what I would call data points or examples from Chinese behavior in the modern era that say, look, they are trying to sort of, get us out of the way and be able to have more of their way more of the time. What I saw when I went back through and looked at the the modern history of China is something different, which is not that it has been trying to be what we would call a unilateral sort of imposer of rules. It has behaved aggressively in some places. It has expressed its interests in ways that are pointed and perhaps maybe not sort of consistent with the standards and expectations that sort of generally operate in the world. But guess what? Neither have we. We have been plenty ready to throw our weight around to get our way when we've wanted and needed to. And China has more often worked through these multilateral institutions that are part of that post-World War II international order that you mentioned. You know, we have the IMF and World Bank and the United Nations and the WTO now. China had to work really hard to get into a lot of those organizations. And I have to say, they've been very smart since joining them. They've figured out how they work. They generally follow their rules. If they don't like the rules, they try to negotiate and politic within those institutions to change the rules. And so I think those behaviors really matter. I think those are indicative, not just in terms of what it's saying, which it consistently says it wants to be part of a rules-based order and behave multilaterally in ways that benefit everybody. I think they generally are following up those words with deeds. So I arrive at a different conclusion, even based just off of the interpretation of their own documents, but especially in light of the sort of accumulation of activities and behaviors that they've evidenced over the, since the World War II period.
I think that Everything Under the Heavens by Howard French is probably more in your camp, more in your side, and because he talks about that the name encapsulates the old imperial worldview in which China was the central civilization of Asia, while its neighbors who lived in the cultural and military shadow paid tribute and acknowledged its superiority in exchange for trade. It was a position China held in the past through a mixture of bullying and benevolence, and Mr. French suggests that it once again underlies China's ambitions for the future, that it wants to rule its part of the world that it used to rule. What is your kind of reaction response to what Howard French said?
Yeah, I mean, again, China does have a very long history, and part of that history is this system of wielding power and influence under what it understood to be the entire world at the time, everything under the heaven. And it's grounded in its own sort of long history of trying to understand the human existence, not dissimilar to ours. What I would say is that the model, even then, was not China imposing its preferred structures and systems internal to other tribes or city-states or nations or collectives of people. There's an ethnocentrism about the Han Chinese, which is that, you're either Han or you're not. And, you can emulate these practices that they believe they've sort of acquired through collective wisdom over long periods of time and a lot of experience. But it hasn't been this sort of imposition. There's not been this sort of desire to convert other entities to look and operate the same way that China does. And so it's a form absolutely of wielding influence and power and trying to control its near environment, but it's in this sort of different approach. It's not through the sort of pushing something in from the outside. It's demonstrating success and wisdom and power and encouraging others to respect that and to treat it accordingly and then to emulate it.
Well, one thing too is the humiliation aspect that China has experienced. And they mentioned about the nationalist Chinese leader, Chiang Kai-shek, was so obsessed with this and the territorial issue that he wrote "Avenge Humiliation" on the top of every page of his diary for 20 years. A map of national shame created during his rule outlined the territory China must recover to regain its past greatness. It included just not the more familiar island claims, but Mongolia, Korea, Indochina, Singapore, and even parts of India and Pakistan. And also, I've heard that, Yeah, they did not impose their will. It was just everybody understood that China ran things.
Well, it's not dissimilar to how the United States might explain the world after the certainly the fall of the Soviet Union, as everybody just understood that the United States is in charge and mostly gets its way. Look, you bring up the century of humiliation, and I think it is really important to call attention to that. So China's history and the way it is taught nationally is that China was taken advantage of by Western power during a time when China was especially weak, and that parts of its country were carved off by these external powers and now deprive China of its rightful territory. Now, the description you gave is a bit more expansive than what the contemporary party thinks about in terms of Chinese territorial claims, but it is a very intensely felt attachment. This is not a trivial sort of passing fancy. It is taught in schools. And people really feel and believe it very deeply, and it colors a lot of the way that they engage with their region, their neighbors, and also most recently with the United States as regards Taiwan in particular, as sort of part of China that is a rightful part of China. And I don't expect those attachments to change anytime in the near future because it is so deeply held and felt.
The reason I want to spend some time on this, and I almost feel like a whole program is really kind of necessary to understand. You need to understand where China is coming from, and that's been hard for us to understand. You've, as said, went through documents, reams of information, and you do have to explore their past history. It is very important, and yet you have someone else who comes to a slightly or sometimes major different interpretation. I find that as a citizen a struggle because how do you formulate a policy if we don't know what we're up against? And somebody has to, I think, get a handle on it before we can have a proper policy. Right now, does it appear that the war hawks have a little more of the upper hand, or are the ones seeing China more as a competitor, having some influence in the White House?
So, you know, what I will say first of all is that I don't claim to have any particular superpowers that allow me really deeply to understand what's happening in the administration at the moment. So I'm looking at external indicators and some conversations that I have with people who, have better and more direct access than I do at the moment. What I would say is it's really unclear. It's unclear to people in government, and it's unclear to those of us outside government about who, as you say, amongst the different sort of foreign policy factions, which one of those factions and seems to have the most influence over China policy right now. So I think one useful way to think about it in terms of foreign policy, and in particular, this has to do with China. The three sort of main sort of schools or factions, groups of people in the administration right now, when they look at U.S. foreign policy, look back at this international system, the international order that was established after World War II. And you have one group, the sort of traditionalists, who would say, look, that structure served everybody well, globalized trade, multilateral organizations where we could work through our disagreements. The United States was strong. We provided a service with our military, but we got a lot from that. We got a lot of privilege. Similar in finance, the power of the dollar, all of these things have been good for America and good for everybody else too. So why would we mess with it, and let's keep it in place? Then you have a group that you might call the America First group, which sort of says, actually, this international system has been bad for us. We've been taken advantage of. We've put way more into it than we've gotten out of it. And that has to stop now. And frankly, we just need to stop being out there so much and be much more over here. China can do whatever they need to do in their region. We maybe will have some rules. We want to make sure that terms of trade are correct. And there's some limits and sort of carve outs that we would need to accommodate. But we don't need to be in East Asia that way anymore. That's an overextension of our power. We don't need to be in Europe anymore. That's an overextension. We're gonna come back to the Western Hemisphere. And then you have the third group, which is the China hawks, And when they look out at the past in the world, they say, well, look, this international order thing did way too well for China. It was too good to China. They took advantage of it. Their power grew immensely, and now they're a danger to us. This has got to stop, and we can't do it. And the way we need to do it is make sure we can contain them. We make sure that we don't let them take advantage of terms of trade. We make sure that they can't gobble up Taiwan. We need to maintain our military influence in that region and our economic influence and our political influence in that region, because we can't let China take over the world, right? So those are the three sort of general camps. I will say that the change of Mike Waltz, who I associate with that last camp of being a China hawk, his we'll call it a promotion to the, to a Senate confirmed position, right? Suggests to me that is not a good indicator if you're a China hawk, frankly. I think that sort of suggests that there are fewer of those people with direct contact with the president, and I think that really matters because, again, sort of hearing from where I sit, it's the person who speaks to Trump last sometimes speaks to him best. It's the sort of recency bias, and so if you don't have access, then that changes the sort of sway that you're going to have. So when I read the tea leaves, and it really is just sort of trying to look at these little indicators as they pop up, is I think the China hawks are not having a lot of luck. I think the traditionalists are not having a lot of luck. And I think if I were betting on a horse right now, it would be the America First group that is holding more sway now, and not just holding on to what they've got, but expanding their influence.
Which seems to me to fit what Howard French was talking about, China having, kind of its control over its area. The Europe has control there. Instead of the unipolar world, we have a multipolar world, which America First, by its very nature, I think you get a result. Again, this is a topic I wish I could talk with you longer, but I know our audience very much wants to know where we are right now with the tariff war and Taiwan. So can you update us a little bit? Having taught economics, looked at trade agreements, I'm always upset when I see the news that there's been an agreement reached with China on trade. There's no agreement that's been reached. There's just an agreement we would lower until we can reach an agreement. But where are you hearing the current status is with all of this?
Well, I think that you've just nailed it, is that, we, it's not really a deal. Tariffs are still high. I mean, it's not, the full trade embargo level tariffs that we started with, but, fundamentally the levels are still well higher than they have been in the past. They still will change the experience of consumers and businesses in the United States. And this is a 90-day reprieve. Now, when you talk to people who are very experienced in trade negotiations, who have done this sort of thing before and with China, they say there's there's a marathon yet to go. I mean, that these deals take years really to negotiate in any meaningful sense. And so, in terms of the substance, like you said, we don't really have a deal yet. We have an agreement that will start that very long process towards a deal. And in the meantime, we'll still continue to experience, all of the ill effects of higher tariffs. The other element here is not just the economics, though, it's also the politics of it, which is, and people have somewhat mixed views, but from what I've seen, more of the view tends to be that China looks pretty good right now about how they handled this situation. They held firm. They didn't back down. They had a very good messaging campaign, which was, look, trade wars hurt everybody. We certainly don't want one, but if we're going to be in one, we will fight till the end. And they said that over and over. There was no semblance of cracks or weakness, or that if you just push the right lever, they're gonna fall apart. They were very, very resolute in positioning themselves. And at the same time, they then also messaged to other current and potential trade partners to say, look, we're here, we're ready to trade. We're not going to be sort of slapping tariffs on and off and changing, creating, uncertainty. We want to work with you. We want to work in respectful ways. We want to continue to use the WTO and multilateralism as the mechanism for sorting out our differences. So, they drew this contrast between the way the Trump administration is handling its desires for trade and its own approach to handling its desires for trade. So I think generally there is the view that there are no winners in the current situation, but if there was more of a not loser, it would be China, at least politically and diplomatically right now.
Yeah, and I worry. I still have the family farm, and so I worry it'll be like the last trade agreement that the administration worked, that China would buy all the soybeans, and then they didn't. So we still don't know, even after the agreements, even if they'll fall through. A couple of things before we move on to Taiwan connected with the trade. One is I've heard quite a bit, read quite a bit about the rare earth minerals that China controls, that they have been using that as well. Is there anything else you can tell us if that's been somewhat effective?
So the specifics about whether or not they're relaxing what they've done in terms of cutting off our access to those critical minerals, there aren't a lot of details right now, so it's pretty unclear. The interesting thing about those is they're called rare earths, but they're not rare so much as that they're really important, but also really hard to get and to refine. And they really have invested in those areas, the extraction and refinement of these critical minerals for decades. And that's important because it takes decades to get that capability. So it is a real point of leverage for them. There are a lot of sort of advanced kinds of applications that we rely on some of those inputs for, and it's just not possible to compensate for the supply lines coming from China. It would take at least a decade probably to be up and running on those. So I think it's one of those things that cuts both ways. They know that they have a real choke point there, but they also know that that's a really fast way to sort of inflame a lot of people if they squeeze on that a little too hard, too soon, or imprudently. So my thought about it is that they'll probably continue to be very strategic about when they deploy that particular piece of leverage.
Great observation. The other thing is, if I'm China, Trump's tariffs have really alienated a lot of countries across the globe. If I were China, this is the moment I would go in and seize to pull countries definitely away from the United States. But China's not known as being a sweet, loving diplomatic core, the Road and Belt Initiative and so forth. But at the same time, I am reading articles in foreign policy, foreign affairs, that this is something maybe is in China's mind right now. What are you hearing?
No, I think absolutely that's true. Look, China has been trying to engage with parts of the world that the United States has been either disinterested in engaging with or has had sort of put a lot of conditions on our engagement with. So places in the developing world, in particular, Africa, Latin America, and China fancies itself a developing nation still, and so it tries to engage with them in that way. And they've had some success and some difficulties, as you note. Similarly, with their approach to diplomacy, there was a period where China was pursuing what was called wolf warrior diplomacy, where they were coming in as exactly as it sounds, sort of with a lot of snarling and teeth baring and snapping at people. And it turns out that didn't work. Surprise! It didn't really generate the success that they thought it might. And so they've backed off from that. So in that sense, China, I think recently has done a pretty good job of receiving the message of what doesn't work well and learning. And what I see right now is with that messaging about, look, we're being good stewards of the international trading system. We're here to work with you. We're not going to do tariffs. But they haven't been overdoing it. They haven't been overplaying that hand and trying to pressure partners. They haven't been, they've been sort of like saying, we're here and we're available. Because I think that they know if they press too hard and too fast, that again won't won't generate the effects. They would love, by the way, to sort things out with Europe. I mean, the European market is huge. And we're basically saying, I guess we're not interested in the way that we have been in the past. And by the way, we have government officials insulting our allies. So China's just sitting there, I think, like watching this and thinking to itself. I have a colleague who puts it nicely. He said, well, what do you do when your enemy is messing up? You let them, right? You just stay out of the way, you know? And I think that's China really has adopted that posture, but boy, would they really love to see this continue and find the right inroads to make with Europe and these other markets. It's worked well. Look, right now, the ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, the Singapores and the Vietnam and the Malaysias and that collection of countries, their view of China right now is more favorable than it is of the United States. And that surprises some people in the United States because they say, well, I mean, don't you see China as this threat, this military threat and this coercive economic threat? And right now they really don't, or at least they don't see it being worse in those ways than they see us in the United States. So I think China so far has done, again, a reasonably good job of being prudent about how they're taking advantage of this moment and staying out of the way and waiting to see how things unfold and where their opportunities will lie.
I know I'm kind of sitting here looking at a reorganization of the international order and international trade and the global economy. It's, as you're saying, the markets are going to have to shift around if they don't feel United States is reliable. Let's get to Taiwan. You and I had talked earlier, the gray zone. There's so many things with China, and I see the time passing quickly here. But let's do Taiwan, but because I want to finish with artificial intelligence, because that to me is one of the real keys at the moment. But what can you tell us where the situation is with Taiwan, the U.S., and China right now?
So, as you well know, Taiwan has become this considerable flashpoint, not just in US-China relations, but I think globally there's a lot of attention on Taiwan right now, in part because of its role in artificial intelligence, which we can talk about a little later on, but also because it has become a focal point of the US-China relationship. You mentioned earlier the century of humiliation and the loss of territory. Well, again, Taiwan is a very intensely felt part of that. The CCP and a lot of Chinese on the mainland believe deeply that Taiwan is part of China and China cannot be complete until Taiwan is returned to China, in their view. The United States has not taken a position about the status of Taiwan. It has a sort of complicated set of policies that basically say, okay, there is an autonomously operating government on the island of Taiwan. And then there is the CCP on the mainland. We acknowledge that both of these things are true. And we acknowledge that the mainland believes that there is only one China. We can stipulate all of those things, and our view is we're not going to say whether or not Taiwan should be fully independent and its own nation or should not be. What we're going to say is you guys have to sort it out peacefully, right? Whatever resolution you arrive at peacefully, we will respect. We have no sort of desire to place our thumb on the scale of which way or the other. That's the way the policies were oriented. And our role was basically to provide a military sort of backstop to the possibility of force by saying, look, we know that if Taiwan declares independence, China will attack. I mean, just full stop. And because China has made that very clear, the mainland has made that very clear. That's just what will happen. Doesn't matter if they think they will win or lose or not, they will go, right? So we've basically said to Taiwan, like, you don't get a free pass, you don't get to just sort of declare independence and assume we'll defend you. But also CCP, if you launch an unprovoked attack on the island, we might come in full force and defend, right? We're not going to sort of provide absolute clarity about what we will or won't do, but you need to know you'll be running a very high risk that the US would come to Taiwan's military defense, and that should affect how you think about what you're going to do here. So, what has changed over the course of history is China's military capability. That changes the equation for the United States. In the past, it was clear if we were going to go to war with Taiwan or with the mainland China anywhere, we would win. That is no longer the case. It is no longer clear, and that has made people concerned that sort of status quo situation, that equilibrium where Taiwan has no incentive to declare independence and the CCP has no incentive to attack the island by force. Now people are worrying that equilibrium has changed. So there's that basic. The United States has changed a bit of our policy, or our behavior at least, as we've appreciated this change in the military balance. And you've seen activity at Congress that is sort of more directly supportive of Taiwan. It doesn't support Taiwan independence, but it sort of is, it's a change from the very careful status quo that we've had. We had Nancy Pelosi, when she was still Speaker of the House, visit the island, which was not something that had happened before. And the CCP viewed it as an expression of support in a way that they found objectionable. So you see more of these sorts of frictions developing. And so it's become very tense and contentious and frankly, quite dangerous.
I was interested with the situation between Pakistan and India, the observation of the Chinese-made military aircraft and missiles. I think that's the one thing, and China's saying, well, until they're in a war, they're not going to know how any of this is going to work. Their troops have not been in, combat like we've had our U.S. military. So you're never quite sure. It becomes a guess. But my understanding is that the Chinese military equipment seemed to accredit itself pretty well. Is that what you heard, or?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, look, we should just generally expect engineering products to come from China, especially in the military apparatus, to be of reasonably good quality at this point. And it seems to be that was demonstrably the case recently. Look, the only other thing, look, China has changed its military a lot, not just in terms of how it's equipped and sort of the assets and platforms that it has, but how it's organized and structured and how it thinks about what warfare would look like. And it has had the sort of benefit, if you will, of being able to prepare its military for basically one kind of war, which is a regional war over Taiwan. And so a lot of it has been sort of very much oriented around that. And they've made some changes that most military analysts think are quite significant. It is true that they haven't been in combat since 1979. What I would say in return is that even though we have, and the US military is exceptional, no question, it is the case that none of the wars we have engaged in have gone the way that we thought that they would either. Dwight Eisenhower said, one thing I know about war for sure is it never is the one that you think you're going to fight when you start. And so, there's an enormous amount of uncertainty for China, but also for us, if there were to be a war that might have something to do with recent experience fighting, and it might not.
Let's get to the AI here, because I want to make sure we've got some time on that. I read your piece, Artificial Intelligence, Geopolitics, and the U.S.-China Relationship, but in the time remaining, I'm going to change this up. I want to focus a little bit on the conversation which said China leans into using AI even as the U.S. leads in developing it. And they talked about how they're doing the application, but a lot of it is for social control. But they also talk about a strategic military advantage AI has. Can you tell us more how China is using AI for its military?
Sure. So from what we can tell, and look, I'll confess right away. I actually am unconvinced about sort of this dramatic effect that AI will have on military affairs. I think we tend to get a little hyperbolic about it. And I think that there are reasons for that, and they're not unfounded. But when we look at the sort of fundamentals of war fighting, they stay constant. We use different technologies. AI will certainly be an important one. It has been, an important one. Precision guided munitions are basically an early form of what we now consider applied AI. So it's not to discount that it will introduce any number of changes. I'm just not convinced that it will be revolutionary changes. What China has done with sort of digital modernization, or if you want to put it under the umbrella of AI for shorthand, is that they've been sort of very forward in thinking about how communications and command and control, which are all now digitally, controlled and involve satellites a lot. They've been very forward on thinking about how to use those in the conduct of warfare, not so much about sort of embedding it in the things that go boom, but the things that have to do with positioning and tracking and targeting. AI helps with all of those tasks, but those are really hard tasks. Tracking, I mean, it turns out that the Pacific Ocean is very big. It's just very big and it looks the same. So there's not a lot of distinguishing characteristics that, programs can work with to sort of track things out there. And so all of those things, the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, China's military is working on those. We're certainly working on those, but it's going to be a measure countermeasure sort of battle for a good long while. So I don't see artificial intelligence enabled technologies in the near term making a dramatic difference in terms of the U.S.-China military balance.
Interesting. I know Ukraine, everybody's watching because we keep changing our views on things, I think, as we watch things evolve in Ukraine. Autonomous, I think, is something that everybody's looking more to not have the cost of human lives being lost. The more you can use autonomous seems to be big. The what Can you tell us a little more about China's use of AI with monitoring its citizens, controlling information, and so on?
Well, so I'll say I'm not a deep expert on those issues, but except to say that I know it certainly does happen, and they use it for some social control purposes, as you rightly note. This is, I think, sort of deeply rooted in not just the CCP's political desires to retain power, but it's something that goes back, historically throughout China, to say that the job of the government is to provide social stability. And the way it's implemented now with the CCP is I don't like it personally in terms of being able to monitor citizens' behaviors and to, track what they're doing and intervene, detain. They have this social credit system where people are monitored for doing good things for society and not good things, and you get certain chits and rewards or punishments accordingly. I mean, it feels very intrusive, I think, by our standards, and has some problematic implications for sure. So that's certainly happening. They also, however, you mentioned that they're really leading on sort of discovering new applications of AI for everyday purposes. And that is certainly true. And I think it's something that's underappreciated here, which is China got this reputation for a long time of stealing and copying. And they did, they absolutely did. But that's not where we are today. They had a very cutthroat tech sector, and competition there was really fierce. And so you weren't just going to get by based on copying for too long. And so they have a very rich sort of tinkerer's world with AI, which is they are busily using AI to solve everyday problems, like at a really rapid pace. It's really, they are innovating now. So that dynamic has changed considerably. I would like to see it more for benign purposes than the sort of surveillance state. So we'll hope for the best on that count, I guess.
Well, there was a quote you had by Robert Kahn, Director of Information Processing Techniques out of the Office of Defense. and about 1983. He says the nation that dominates the information processing field will possess the keys to world leadership. Data right now is what, and China seems to be by hook or crook is really working hard to gather all the data it can. This really seems to be an area that is exploding of how to get all the information you can on almost every human being on the planet. Um, who's leading in that area? Is the United States still?
I don't think anybody is, truthfully. I mean, the problem, I guess one of the questions I have, I know there's concerns, for example, about Chinese technology in automobiles, self-driving automobiles, and whether they can collect data on US citizens.
Oh,
And in a sense, I understand that sort of data concern. On the other hand, it's so much data, the volumes and volumes of data. It's one thing to say you can vacuum it all up, but it's a whole other thing to say you can do anything with it. The processing demands, the analytical demands. I mean, it doesn't do you an awful lot of good just to have the stuff. You have to have some idea of what you want to do with it, and then have the wherewithal to be able to do that. So I actually, again, this is another place where I tend not to worry so much about data. There's plenty of it to go around. It's really going to be about who figures out what they want to do with it first. What's the concept behind it?
well, let me close with just about a half hour before I came here to turn on my computer. I read an article that I was reviewing a book that Apple's to blame for the success of China with manufacturing and engineering. And the reviewer at the end said, well, it's both. Apple benefited and China certainly benefited. And I hadn't thought about how much Apple really had trained so many thousands and thousands of engineers and workers for parts. And then China took that to expand their ability in manufacturing. So let's close with that. Observations you have on that.
Yeah, I mean that dynamic on the face of it is makes good sense. And I would also highlight that in some sense we are now doing that too with semiconductors. So there's a Taiwanese company, TSMC, that fabricates or manufactures these semiconductor chips, the most sensitive and sophisticated chips in the world. And they are now building factories in the United States, and there's one in Phoenix that has been up and running for some time. Well, it turns out it's really hard to run a semiconductor fab and to run it really well. And we in the United States don't have a trained workforce that's prepared and ready to do that. So, what we've done is put a lot of TSMC's Taiwanese employees on airplanes and have them come over here and help us set up our fab. And then we've sent a lot of our folks over there to learn too. And so we are sort of in that same process of learning how to these very advanced, sophisticated manufacturing techniques from another country. Taiwan is aware of this dynamic too, and there's some people who are very nervous about that and saying, the Apple China sort of comparison, they don't want to lose their lead in their manufacturing capability over in Taiwan either. So, this is one of those difficult challenges about how manufacturing happens and how it distributes the benefits and what happens from there. So we'll have to watch for that dynamic here in the United States.
Well, let me throw a quick future tease. We didn't get into the gray zone. It's fascinating what with all the cyber, the deep fake. I was just reading where AI generated voices of officials have been used, like for states and so on, to try to get information and so on. I mean, there's an ongoing story that I think not only China, obviously Russia and others, and criminal and so on, but China seems to be doing very well at the kind of down in below. So in the future, that's something to think about because I'm very fascinated with it. So thank you so much for answering my questions. And Angela, we'll turn it over for you for questions.
Yeah, I just have a few in the chat. We're going to start with those. Marge asks, what impact on US-China relations are a result of language and cultural differences? And has the US improved our understanding of this difference? Because it's, a lot of letters. Doesn't sound like Spanish. Is language a
Yes.
barrier to understanding each other?
Yeah, so I think that's a really important area to highlight. We actually don't have a lot of China experts and specialists in the United States. We haven't trained up sort of a robust generation of people who really know China. If you think back to the Cold War, we had, oodles of people who spent tons of their time learning everything they could about the Soviet Union and really sort of doing those studies. That
Yeah.
has not been the case with China. We have a very sort of thin bench. And the thing I worry about is, we benefited sort of for some period of time, not just by having US students learn about and go to China, learn the language, learn the culture, learn the history, but we also had a lot of Chinese students come to the United States and get to know us too, and have those what they call people-to-people contacts and gain that sort of cultural, social, human familiarity and not just the language. And I think that really matters when you think about how relations are going to continue into the future. We're going to have, I hope, people continue to try to negotiate and deal with each other in lots of different ways. But so we need that knowledge. We need that sort of kind of connectivity. Right now, a lot of what's happening is pulling in the opposite direction. We are limiting cultural contacts. We are kicking Chinese students out of the country. We are discouraging Americans from going to China. And I think it's a really worrisome trend. So I think if we really need more China experts, not fewer.
And I'll add, and Don can second this, when we have any, if any of us have visited countries that have experienced the Belt and Road Initiative investments, they also have Chinese restaurants and Chinese language institutes and, an entire cultural immersion that is making favorable relations between those countries and their development hosts. So that is something the United States perhaps used to do and doesn't do
You
so much
can't beat
anymore.
KFC in a lot of these countries. Let's face
Yeah,
it.
well, come on. All right. Barbara Ribbons, who is at the Varner International Business Institute at ISU, asks or comments, she has a strong background in the US, having spent significant time in Iowa. Who do you think will succeed him, and how might that change how China views the United States?
I'll tell you what, if only I knew. Look, what I know from people who I work with who are much more deeply expert on the intricacies of the CCP and their internal politics is, to their knowledge, she has not picked a successor. And the visibility about what's happening at the high levels of government is sort of, it's becoming more opaque. It's just harder to see anything or understand anything about really what's happening in those deep corridors of power. So at this point, as best I can tell, I mean, maybe there's someone deep in the basement at the CIA who's, got a betting pool going about which one of these people it's going to be. But from all that I've heard, it's nobody is hazarding real guesses at this point. But you're right to highlight that whoever it is not going to be Xi Jinping. And so there will be differences. It will be important to understand as best we can who that new leader is. So I hope, again, that there are people out there studying what we can about how the power relationships and politics are happening in the CCP right now. It'd be good to have a head start.
Yeah, if we could predict that kind of thing in the future, we'd all be rich. But Mark asks, is she personally directing foreign policy? And if so, does the change in term limits for him matter on China's foreign policy?
So I think again, the relying on people who study the CCP more closely, the view generally is that yes, Xi Jinping is directing pretty much everything in foreign policy. Now there's a limit, to how much direct control one person can exercise. So if you remember a few years back, I'm sure you will, the spy balloon incident.
Mhm.
I think the overall conclusion is that was a surprise to Xi Jinping that had happened, and one that sure you imagine he was not well pleased by. And so while he does, I think, direct all of the major muscle movements of foreign policy, that's different from saying he has fine motor control over everything. And of course, his continuation in power perpetuates that. And so a change in term limits, prolongs the duration for which we can anticipate that his views will really direct the course of China and US-China relations.
I'm going to take the liberty of inserting a question of my own because it kind of follows on to the relationship that she has with Putin. And how do you think the relationship is developing? In my own courses, I've called them frenemies, because if the United States was eliminated tomorrow, they would be fighting each other for control of the world. Both of them wants to be number one. And that's my opinion. What do you think about the relationship between China and Russia?
Well, so first, I think there's the relationship between Xi Jinping and Putin, which by most accounts is sincere. That like they sort of seem to think that no one understands them like each other. These two great leaders of these two great historical nations working to fight against U.S. hegemony and carve out their own ability to sort of influence their regions and their country's futures. And I don't know if that extends to them enjoying each other's company, but there does seem to be a real amity between them. That said, I think, you rightly point out, I think that the countries are not what we would call allies. China does not historically create alliances. And that's not the case today. And I think that China was not happy with what happened with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now, I think when I say not happy about it, I won't say that they were unhappy that Putin chose to use force, but what I will say is China was unhappy that it turned out so badly. And that has been a really that's created problems for China that it would very much have preferred not to have. It's especially put a real wrench in their relationship with European countries, because they are seen as supporting Russia in a war that European countries see as threatening European security. So they are, I think, your frenemies is apt in the sense that there's nothing there that you would really count on. They can find a mutual accord and accommodation for now, but I think sort of beyond that, it will be dictated by conditions and circumstance.
Okay.
Angela, before we get another question here in the chat, speaking of problems, we couldn't cover everything, but North Korea and China right now, where are we with that relationship?
Well, so I think this is a place where some of the frenemy part really comes into play. So Putin has been cultivating a closer relationship with North Korea. And I don't think that Xi Jinping and the CCP generally appreciate that. They've sort of generally been the ones in charge of North Korean affairs in terms of the sort of regional dimensions, give or take. And so they, I don't think, like Putin sort of horning in on that territory. It creates this source of unpredictability. It potentially gives Putin leverage that China would prefer that they not have. I think it's a real complicating factor, and on top of all of the other complicating factors that are in play when it comes to North Korea.
Okay.
Well, and we've got one more question in the chat. Caroline asks, is there a fear for students to study China and develop close social ties due to censorship or other complicating political factors?
So I'm going to interpret this about the question being about American students feeling that's downward pressures to do it. So I think it's interesting. I don't know, and here's what I think I can say is that it's going to be harder for students who are inclined to study China to do so, because it's going to be harder to go there. it is already opening people up to scrutiny for being sort of too interested in China. There's very much this sort of chilling effect about sort of, a new Cold War dynamic. And we remember how some of those cultural and student-based dynamics happened during the actual Cold War. And so it wouldn't surprise me if students, on the one hand, feel a little bit uncertain about whether or not they would actually be able to go and have experiences or maintain social connections, and still have the kinds of careers and lives that they would like to have. On the other hand, it could go, as we said earlier, that they say, look, there's a real need for China experts. So I ought to get in that business. I'm interested. It's going to be a growth industry, and there's sort of an incentive there to grow into a role of being the next generation of China experts. I don't know which way that will evolve. I could sort of make an argument in either direction. The truth is, it'll probably be both to a certain extent. And hopefully we won't go through some of the same sort of McCarthy era kinds of experiences this time, as we hopefully openly try to learn about this other really consequential actor in international politics. But we'll have to see how things go from here, I think.
Angela,
If I may,
yeah,
let
go
me
ahead, go ahead.
let me turn it around to the Chinese students studying in the United States. When they return home, we've heard the stories that they're obligated to tell the Chinese government what they worked on, what they learned, share their data, their technology, their skills and talents. Is that accurate, or is that just a something that's been motivating the anti-Chinese sentiment that's growing in the United States?
I don't know. I don't know how accurate it is. I don't have any sort of direct exposure to either data on that, other kinds of evidence, even anecdotal from Chinese going back. So I'm really not sure. But what I would say is, we often overstate how much direct control the CCP can have and how much access they can have to every individual moving through the system that way. And we understate the extent to which that some similar dynamics happen here. It's not that American students are having to go report to government, minders about what their experiences were. But if you want certain jobs in the US government, you are absolutely going to tell that agency every contact you've had with anybody who's a foreign national at any time. Right. And so, I don't know how much to make of it on China's side. I think that what we do here is not malign. It's not intended to sort of control anybody, but there are both more legitimate and less legitimate reasons governments would have an interest in those kinds of experiences that their students and other nationals are having.
Angela, before I let you close, I thought our audience might be interested that Melanie and Dan Pat did a After Primacy U.S. Military Options in Contemporary East Asia. It was December 20th of last year. And what it is scenarios for military options. I found it extremely interesting. There's just so much in it. So for those in our audience who want to dig further and kind of have their minds challenged to the various possibilities that could happen, I would recommend that. Melanie, what would be the easiest way to find that?
So thanks for pointing that one out. I would also note that sort of, if you're somebody who's interested in these, what we call the gray zone or sub-threshold, not outright direct conflict kinds of operations and things we do with our military, there's some of that in there for you. But the best way to find that is on the Brookings website. Just to search on the title, or even if you go to my page at Brookings, there should be a way to access a link to those sorts of publications there.
Yeah, I should have mentioned you had 8 areas: invasions and blockades of Taiwan, the Gray Zone, South China Sea issue, Senkaku, regional sea lanes, cyber attacks, and political subversion in Taiwan, which that really seems to be kicking up now. So that's why I said there's a lot to cover, but it is very interesting. I recommend it to our audience. All right. Thank
So
you, Mel.
with that, is there anybody with a pressing question they didn't feel like typing in the chat? Otherwise, I'm going to close it with a great deal of gratitude. I have attended several of the Brookings webinars, and they are always informational. You are a class of experts that are unmatched. So we are honored that you shared your evening with us this evening. So on behalf of the World Affairs Council, thank you, Melanie. Thank you, Don, for your masterful moderating again.